The flames licked at the pages of Florence Sullivan's treasured copy of Pride and Prejudice, her heart shattering as her father tossed another precious volume into the roaring fire, his face contorted with rage beneath the New Mexico sunset. "Books won't feed you, girl. Books won't make you a proper wife," he bellowed, while Florence fought back tears that threatened to drown her, much like the rain that had refused to fall on their parched land for 3 long seasons. Florence stood frozen, her 18 years of life seeming to crumble before her, as the fire consumed the words that had been her only escape from the hardships of frontier life in Deeming, New Mexico Territory, 1878. The crackling of the pages sounded like screams to her ears, each one a friend being tortured before her eyes. Her collection had been modest, just 15 books gathered over years through trades, gifts, and the occasional purchase when the traveling salesman came through town, but they had been her entire world. "Pa, please," she whispered, her voice breaking as she watched her father grab the last book from the crate she'd hidden beneath her bed. "These are all I have." Jerome Sullivan's weathered face hardened as he held the leather-bound volume. "All you have. You have a roof over your head, girl. You have chores that need doing. Your mother's been gone 2 years, and instead of helping run this household, I find you with your nose in these foolish stories." He threw the final book into the fire with such force that embers scattered across the hearth. Florence's heart plummeted to her stomach as she watched the flames consume the last of her literary companions. The drought had made her father meaner. Harder, the failing crops and dying cattle had turned his disappointment inward, then outward toward his only daughter. "Since your mother died, you've done nothing but dream away in these pages while I've worked my fingers to the bone," he spat. "No more. Tomorrow you start helping Widow Jenkins with her laundry business. She'll pay you a fair wage and you'll contribute to this household properly." Florence knew arguing was futile. Her father had made up his mind, and in his world, a woman's education was an unnecessary frivolity. As she retreated to her small bedroom that night, the smell of burning paper still clinging to her clothes, Florence made a silent promise to herself. Somehow, someday, she would have books again. The next morning dawned hot and unforgiving, typical for June in the southern New Mexico Territory. Florence rose before the sun, preparing her father's breakfast and packing his lunch before he headed out to the struggling fields. Their interactions were stilted, full of the unspoken tension from the previous evening. "I expect you home by supper," Jerome said gruffly, not looking up from his plate of eggs and biscuits. "Widow Jenkins knows to send you back by then." "Yes, Pa," Florence replied, her eyes downcast. As she walked the dusty half-mile to town, Florence allowed her tears to fall freely. No one would see her on this lonely stretch, and by the time she reached Deeming proper, she would have composed herself. The town had grown substantially since the railroad had come through 5 years earlier, but it was still small enough that everyone knew everyone's business. Widow Jenkins's laundry operation was housed in a small building behind her home, with a large yard full of clotheslines. The older woman greeted Florence with a sympathetic smile that suggested news of the book burning had already reached her ears. "Good morning, dear," she said kindly. "I'm glad to have the help, though I'm sorry for the circumstances." Florence managed a thin smile. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mrs. Jenkins. Now, the work isn't complicated, but it's hard on the hands and back," the widow explained, leading Florence to a series of large washing tubs. "I do laundry for most of the businesses in town, the hotel, the saloon, the barber shop, and for some of the wealthier families who can afford the service." Florence nodded, rolling up her sleeves. Though her father's farm had always been physically demanding, The constant immersion in hot water and lye soap was a different kind of labor. By midday, her hands were red and beginning to crack, but she worked without complaint. It was during the afternoon, as she was hanging sheets on the line, that Florence first saw him. A man she'd never encountered before, riding the most magnificent black stallion she'd ever laid eyes on. He was tall in the saddle, with broad shoulders and a tan Stetson pulled low over his eyes. Unlike most cowboys who pass through Deeming, his clothes, though dusty from the trail, appeared to be of good quality. The stranger slowed his horse as he passed the widow's property, tipping his hat politely when he noticed Florence looking. She quickly averted her gaze, focusing intently on the sheet in her hands, but not before catching a glimpse of striking blue eyes and a strong, clean-shaven jawline. "That's Xavier Harper," Widow Jenkins said, appearing at Florence's side with another basket of wet linens. "He bought the old Donaldson place about a month ago. Keeps to himself mostly but pays well for his laundry," she chuckled, nodding toward a small bundle of men's clothing. "Those are his, in fact, due to be delivered tomorrow." Florence felt a flutter of curiosity. "The Donaldson place." "But that's been abandoned for years." "Indeed it was, until Mr. Harper came along. He's been fixing it up something fierce. Hired half the men in town at one point or another to help with repairs." The widow sighed appreciatively. "They say he came from back east somewhere. Has money, that one. But not the kind that looks down on honest folk." The rest of the day passed in a blur of soap suds and heavy linens, but Florence couldn't help but wonder about the mysterious Xavier Harper. What would bring a wealthy Easterner to a dusty frontier town like Deeming? And why would he choose the dilapidated Donaldson Ranch, 5 miles outside of town, when he could have purchased better land elsewhere? When Florence returned home that evening, her father was already seated at the table, waiting for his supper. She quickly set about preparing a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and the last of their cured ham. They ate in silence until Jerome finally spoke. "Widow Jenkins says you're a good worker. Says you didn't complain once, even when your hands started bleeding." Florence looked down at her raw, cracked hands. "There's no point in complaining about honest work." Jerome nodded, something like approval in his eyes for the first time in months. "You'll toughen up. Those books' soft hands needed some real labor." Florence bit her tongue to keep from responding. Her father had never understood that reading wasn't an escape from work, but a different kind of labor, one that exercised the mind rather than the body. In her mother's final days, Florence had read to her for hours, the stories providing comfort that medicine could not. But her father had only seen it as time wasted. "I'll need you to take some eggs into town tomorrow morning before you go to the widow's," Jerome said, pushing back from the table. "We can't eat them all and we need the money." "Yes, Pa," Florence replied automatically, already dreading another day of harsh soap and steaming water. The next morning, with a basket of eggs carefully packed, Florence headed into town earlier than usual. The main street was just beginning to stir, shopkeepers unlocking doors and sweeping boardwalks. She sold the eggs to the hotel restaurant for a fair price and was turning to head to Widow Jenkins's when a voice called out to her. "Miss." "Excuse me, miss." Florence turned to see a slender man with spectacles waving from the doorway of a shop she hadn't noticed before. A new sign hung above the door, "Deeming Mercantile and General Store." "Yes," she replied, approaching cautiously. "I couldn't help but notice those farm-fresh eggs," the man said, smiling broadly. "I'm Elijah Parker, just opened this establishment last week. If you've got eggs to sell regularly, I'd be interested in buying." The railroad brings plenty of customers through who prefer a hot breakfast to travel rations. Florence considered this. "My father's hens aren't laying as much with the drought, but we usually have some to spare. I could bring what we have. Excellent. And I pay cash on delivery, Mr. Parker said, extending his hand. We're still stocking up, getting a feel for what folks need around here. If there's anything specific your family requires, I'd be happy to order it. As Florence shook his hand, her eyes drifted past him into the store. Along one wall, she saw something that made her breath catch, a small bookshelf with perhaps 24 volumes. Mr. Parker followed her gaze and smiled knowingly. Are you a reader, Miss Sullivan? Florence Sullivan, she replied, unable to tear her eyes from the books. And yes, I used to be. Used to be, he questioned. One doesn't simply stop being a reader in my experience. Florence felt a lump form in her throat. My books were lost recently. Understanding dawned in the shopkeeper's eyes. I see. Well, Miss Sullivan, perhaps we could arrange a trade sometime. Eggs for books. Just a thought. The possibility made Florence's heart soar, but reality quickly dampened her spirits. My father wouldn't approve. He believes reading is a waste of time for women. Mr. Parker's kind expression faltered. That's a shame. Knowledge should be for everyone. He glanced at the position of the sun. You seem to be on your way somewhere. Please don't let me keep you, but do consider my offer about the eggs. Florence thanked him and hurried to Widow Jenkins's, her mind whirling with possibilities and fears. Her father would never allow her to trade for books, but perhaps she could save some of her laundry earnings. But where would she keep them? Her father had proven he would destroy any books he found. The day's work was even harder than the previous one, with a large order from the saloon requiring scrubbing of stubborn stains. By mid-afternoon, Florence's back ached fiercely, and her hands were bleeding again despite the cloth wrappings Widow Jenkins had provided. Florence, dear, the widow called from the doorway of the wash-house. I need you to make a delivery for me. Mr. Harper's things are ready, and he's paid extra for same-day service when possible. Florence looked up from the washtub, pushing a strand of damp hair from her face. To the Donaldson place. Isn't that quite far? It is, the widow agreed, which is why I've arranged for you to use Mr. Thompson's wagon. He's lending it to us for an hour. The drive will give your hands a rest, and I'll deduct the time from your pay. Despite her exhaustion, Florence welcomed the change of pace. Within 20 minutes, she was seated on the bench of a small wagon, a neatly wrapped package of laundered clothes beside her, heading out of town toward the Donaldson Ranch. The landscape of southern New Mexico spread out around her vast stretches of desert, dotted with mesquite and creosote bush, the distant mountains hazy in the afternoon heat. As she followed the rutted dirt road, Florence allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to live free from her father's disapproval, to read whatever she wanted, whenever she wanted. The Donaldson place came into view as she crested a small rise. Florence gasped softly at the transformation. What had once been a dilapidated homestead was now a respectable ranch house with a fresh coat of white paint. The barn had been rebuilt, and a corral now held several fine horses. A windmill turned lazily in the breeze, pumping water into a large tank. As she pulled the wagon into the yard, the front door opened, and Xavier Harper stepped onto the porch. Without his hat, Florence could see he had thick, dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. His blue eyes were even more striking up close, set in a face that was handsome without being pretty. He appeared to be in his late 20s or early 30s, with the confident bearing of a man comfortable in his own skin. "Miss Sullivan," he said, his voice a pleasant baritone with just a hint of an Eastern accent. "Widow Jenkins mentioned you'd be working with her." Florence was momentarily taken aback. "You know my name," a small smile lifted the corner of his mouth. "It's a small town. Word travels." He descended the porch steps and approached the wagon. "I appreciate the delivery. Would you care for some water or lemonade before you head back?" The day's a scorcher. Florence hesitated. It was a tempting offer. Her throat was parched from the dusty drive, but propriety dictated she shouldn't enter a bachelor's home alone. Xavier seemed to read her thoughts. "We can sit on the porch if that would be more comfortable." "I wouldn't want to compromise your reputation." His thoughtfulness decided her. "Lemonade would be lovely, thank you." He helped her down from the wagon, his hand strong and steady around hers. As they walked toward the house, Florence noticed additional improvements. Flower beds had been dug along the front of the house, though they stood empty in the drought conditions. A rocking chair and small table adorned the porch, and the windows gleamed with new glass. "You've done wonders with the place," she commented as he held the door for her. "Thank you. It's been a labor of—" Xavier stopped mid-sentence as Florence stepped into the house and froze in wonder. Books. Everywhere. The entire main room of the house had been transformed into a library. Bookshelves lined every wall from floor to ceiling, and a rolling ladder allowed access to the highest shelves. A comfortable-looking leather sofa and 2 armchairs were arranged near a stone fireplace, with reading lamps positioned strategically. A large desk stood by the window, papers neatly arranged upon it. Florence couldn't speak. She moved forward as if in a trance, her fingers reaching out to touch the leather-bound spines reverently. "You like books," Xavier said softly behind her, a statement rather than a question. "I love them," Florence whispered, tears suddenly pricking at her eyes as she remembered her own lost volumes. "I've never seen so many in one place." Xavier stepped further into the room. "I brought most of them from Boston. My family's library there was much larger, but I couldn't bear to leave them all behind when I moved west." He gestured toward the kitchen. "Let me get that lemonade. Please, feel free to look around." As he disappeared through a doorway, Florence moved slowly along the shelves, reading titles with increasing amazement. Works of fiction sat alongside books on history, science, philosophy, and art. Some were in languages she didn't recognize, French perhaps, or Latin. Others were illustrated with beautiful plates showing plants, animals, or distant lands. When Xavier returned with 2 glasses of lemonade, he found Florence seated in one of the armchairs, a volume of Shakespeare's collected works open on her lap. "I hope you don't mind," she said, quickly closing the book. "I couldn't resist." "Not at all," he replied, handing her a glass. "Books are meant to be read." He settled into the chair opposite her. "Widow Jenkins mentioned you're Jerome Sullivan's daughter. Your family has the farm about 3 miles north of town." Florence nodded, taking a sip of the tart, refreshing lemonade. "Yes, though it's barely a farm these days. The drought has been hard on everyone." "Indeed it has," Xavier agreed. "I've been fortunate that the Donaldson place came with good water rights. The underground spring feeds the windmill well enough even in these conditions." A comfortable silence fell between them as they drank their lemonade. Florence found herself studying Xavier when he glanced out the window. There was something different about him compared to the local men she knew. He carried himself with the ease of someone who had never known true hardship, yet there was a solidity to him that suggested he wasn't afraid of hard work. "May I ask why you left Boston for Deeming?" Florence inquired. "It seems quite a change." Xavier's expression turned thoughtful. "My father died last year. He was a successful merchant, trading primarily with Europe and the Orient. I was expected to take over the business, but—" he shrugged. "I had different dreams. When I received my inheritance, I decided to chart my own course." "And that course led you to the New Mexico territory?" "Indirectly. I traveled for several months exploring different regions. When I reached Santa Fe, I heard about railroad opportunities further south." Deeming, being at the intersection of two major lines, seemed a promising location for investment. He smiled. Plus, I found I enjoyed the openness of the land, the honest nature of the people. Florence glanced at the books surrounding them. And you brought your library with you. Books are the best companions, Xavier said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. They ask for nothing but time and offer worlds in return. He tilted his head, studying her. You understand that, I think. Florence felt her eyes fill with tears again, and she quickly looked down at her glass. I did. Once. Xavier leaned forward slightly. What happened? The kindness in his voice broke the dam of her emotions. Before she could stop herself, Florence was telling him everything about her mother's death, her father's increasing bitterness, and finally, the burning of her precious books. He called them foolish, she said, wiping at a stray tear. Said they were filling my head with useless notions and taking me away from my duties. Xavier's expression had darkened as she spoke, his hands gripping the arms of his chair tightly. That's barbaric, he said finally. Books are not just stories, they're knowledge, wisdom, the collected thoughts of great minds throughout history. My father sees them as a distraction, Florence replied sadly, especially for a woman. Xavier shook his head in disbelief. And now you're working for Widow Jenkins instead of reading. The work is honest, Florence defended, though without much conviction, and it pays, which we need badly. I'm not criticizing the work, Xavier clarified quickly. Just the circumstances that forced you into it. He stood suddenly, walking to a shelf and running his fingers along the spines. You know, I have far too many books for one person, if you ever wanted to borrow some. Florence's heart leaped at the offer, but reality quickly dampened her excitement. I have nowhere to keep them. If my father found them, you could read them here, Xavier suggested. I'm often in town on business or working with the horses. The house stands empty most days. Florence stared at him in shock. You would trust a stranger in your home, with your books, Xavier smiled warmly. You're hardly a stranger now, Miss Sullivan, and anyone who treats Shakespeare with the reverence you showed is no threat to my library. The offer was tempting, dangerously so. It's very kind, but I couldn't possibly think about it, Xavier interrupted gently. The invitation stands. Now, I should probably not keep you any longer. Widow Jenkins will be wondering where you've gone. As Florence rode back to town, her mind was awhirl with conflicting emotions. Xavier Harper's unexpected kindness and incredible library had awakened longings she'd been trying to suppress since the book burning. The possibility of access to such a treasure trove was almost overwhelming. But accepting his offer would mean deceiving her father, sneaking away to a bachelor's home, risking her reputation and her father's wrath if discovered. It would be foolish, reckless. And yet, as the wagon rolled into Deeming, Florence knew in her heart that she would return to that library. The pull of books was too strong, the thirst for knowledge too deeply embedded in her soul. Somehow she would find a way. Over the next 2 weeks, Florence fell into a new routine. Her days were spent at Widow Jenkins's, scrubbing and hanging laundry until her arms ached. But the widow, seeing Florence's raw hands and exhausted demeanor, began assigning her less physically demanding tasks when possible, folding the dried laundry, managing deliveries, and keeping the account books. It was this last task that gave Florence her opportunity. The widow, impressed with her quick mind and neat handwriting, asked her to make weekly trips to the bank to deposit their earnings and to various clients to collect payments. These errands often took Florence all over town and occasionally beyond. The first time she returned to Xavier's ranch, it was with legitimate purpose. Widow Jenkins had sent her to collect payment for a large order and to pick up his next batch of laundry. But after their business was concluded, Xavier casually mentioned a new shipment of books he'd received from back east. "Mostly novels," he said, leading her to a crate in the library. "Some Dickens, a bit of Twain. I thought you might enjoy them." Florence knew she should leave immediately her errands for the widow were complete, and lingering would raise questions. But the sight of fresh, unread books was too tempting. "Perhaps just a quick look," she conceded. 1 hour later, she was deep in The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, curled in an armchair while Xavier worked quietly at his desk. The companionable silence was broken only by the occasional turning of pages or scratch of his pen. When Florence finally realized the time, she jumped to her feet in alarm. "I must go. The widow will think something's happened to me." Xavier looked up, concern etching his features. "I'm sorry I shouldn't have kept you." "You didn't," Florence assured him, reluctantly placing the book on a side table. "I lost track of time. It's been so long since I've been able to read freely." Before she could leave, Xavier picked up the book she'd been reading. "Take it with you," he urged. Florence shook her head regretfully. "I can't. My father would never need to know," Xavier finished. He retrieved a satchel from a hook by the door. "Use this. Say it contains laundry supplies the widow asked you to purchase." The temptation was overwhelming. Florence hesitated only briefly before accepting both the book and the satchel. "I'll return it as soon as I can," she promised. That night, after her father had fallen asleep, Florence lit a small candle and read for hours, hidden beneath her blankets. The joy of losing herself in a story again was indescribable, worth every risk. Over the following weeks, Florence found more reasons to visit Xavier's ranch. Sometimes the widow sent her. Other times, she'd claim to be running errands that took her in that direction. With each visit, their connection deepened. Xavier began recommending books based on her interests, delighting in her quick mind and thoughtful observations. For his part, Xavier found himself increasingly captivated by Florence. Her resilience in the face of her father's oppression, her hunger for knowledge, and her gentle spirit touched something in him that had been dormant during his years in Boston society. The young women he'd known there had been educated but often superficial, concerned more with appearances and social standing than with ideas. Florence was different. Despite her limited formal education, she possessed a natural intelligence and curiosity that outshone many college-educated men of his acquaintance. And there was a sweetness to her, an authenticity that was refreshing after the calculated social interactions of his former life. As summer progressed, their meetings became more frequent. Xavier taught Florence to ride his gentlest mare, allowing her to visit more easily and giving her the freedom to explore the surrounding countryside. They would discuss books for hours, debate philosophical ideas, or simply sit in companionable silence while reading separate volumes. One particularly hot afternoon in late July, they sat on the porch, seeking relief from the stifling indoor heat. Xavier had prepared cold tea, and they sipped it gratefully as a rare breeze stirred the air. "I've been thinking," Xavier said hesitantly, "about your situation at home." Florence tensed slightly. Their unspoken agreement had been to focus on books and ideas, avoiding the painful reality of her home life whenever possible. "Your father's treatment of you is wrong," Xavier continued, his voice gentle but firm. "Burning your books was an act of cruelty, not discipline." "He believes he's protecting me," Florence replied, though without conviction. "In his mind, books led me astray from my proper duties." Xavier set down his glass with more force than necessary. "That's nonsense. Reading makes you more capable, not less. Look at how quickly you learned to keep Widow Jenkins's accounts. Your mind is extraordinary, Florence. It deserves cultivation, not suppression." Florence felt warmth spread through her at his words, at the genuine admiration in his eyes. No one had ever spoken of her intellect that way before. "What would you suggest?" she asked softly. "I cannot change my father's views." Xavier hesitated, then reached for her hand. It was the first time he had touched her since helping her from the wagon on that first day, and the contact sent a jolt of awareness through her. "Come work for me," he said earnestly. "I need someone to help organize my library properly, to catalog the books and perhaps even correspond with booksellers back east. I would pay you fairly better than the widow does, and you would have access to all the books you could possibly read." Florence stared at him, stunned by the offer. "You cannot be serious." "I'm entirely serious," Xavier insisted, his blue eyes intent on hers. "You have a gift, Florence. It's being wasted on laundry." "My father would never allow it," she replied, though her heart raced at the possibility. "He barely tolerates my work for the widow, and that's only because we need the money." "Then tell him I'm paying more," Xavier suggested. "It's the truth, after all." Florence shook her head. "It's not just the money. He would never permit me to work for a single man in his home. The impropriety of it would be too much." Xavier's expression fell, but he nodded in understanding. "Of course, I wasn't thinking." But the seed had been planted. As Florence rode back to town that afternoon, her mind whirled with possibilities. Working with books every day, being surrounded by knowledge, spending time with Xavier. The prospect was intoxicating. The solution came from an unexpected source. The following Sunday after church, Widow Jenkins pulled Florence aside. "Mr. Harper came to see me yesterday," she said without preamble. "He proposed an interesting arrangement." Florence felt her cheeks warm. Had Xavier gone behind her back? "He's offered to hire you to organize his library," the widow continued. "But knowing your father might object to you working in a bachelor's home, he suggested you could be officially employed by me, with part of your time spent at his ranch. I would accompany you for propriety's sake, bringing my mending along. The arrangement would benefit us all. You would earn more. I would receive a portion for my trouble, and Mr. Harper would get his books properly cataloged." Florence was speechless. Xavier had found a way around her father's objections, a solution that maintained propriety while giving her what she most desired. "What do you think?" the widow prompted. "I told him I would discuss it with you before approaching your father." "I think it's wonderful," Florence managed, her voice thick with emotion. "If my father agrees." "Leave your father to me," Widow Jenkins said with a determined smile. "Men respect pragmatism and profit. We'll present it as a business opportunity, not a chance for you to indulge in reading." True to her word, the widow visited the Sullivan farm that evening. Florence waited anxiously on the porch, unable to hear the conversation happening inside but imagining all too clearly her father's likely objections. When the door finally opened, Widow Jenkins emerged looking smug, followed by Jerome Sullivan, who appeared grudgingly resigned. "Your father has agreed to the new arrangement," the widow announced. "Starting tomorrow, you'll divide your time between my laundry and Mr. Harper's library, with me as chaperone for the latter." Jerome frowned at his daughter. "Mind you stick to the work he's paying for. I don't want to hear you've been wasting time reading his fancy books instead of organizing them." "Yes, Pa," Florence agreed quickly, suppressing the joy threatening to bubble over. "I'll work hard, I promise." That night Florence could hardly sleep for excitement. The prospect of legitimate access to Xavier's library, of meaningful work with books, was almost too good to believe. When morning came, she was up before dawn, preparing breakfast and completing her chores with unprecedented energy. The new arrangement worked beautifully. 3 days a week, Florence would accompany Widow Jenkins to Xavier's ranch. where the older woman would sit on the porch with her mending while Florence worked inside cataloging the extensive library. Xavier had ordered a proper card catalog system from back east, and Florence delighted in creating the detailed index of his collection. What had begun as a practical solution soon developed into something more. The widow, bored with sitting on the porch, often dozed off in the afternoon heat. During these times, Xavier and Florence would talk freely, their conversations ranging from literature to philosophy to personal dreams and fears. Florence learned that Xavier had come west not just to escape family expectations, but to find purpose. His wealth had come too easily, inherited rather than earned, and he longed to build something meaningful with his own hands and mind. The ranch was part of that dream, but he also had plans to invest in Deeming's growth, perhaps opening businesses that would create opportunities for the town's residents. In turn, Florence shared memories of her mother, a gentle woman who had taught her to read and had encouraged her love of learning despite her father's disapproval. She spoke of her childhood on the farm, of the years when rain had been plentiful and her father's temper less volatile. And slowly, she began to articulate dreams of her own dreams of education, of a life filled with books and ideas. As summer gave way to autumn, subtle changes appeared in their interactions. Xavier's gaze would linger on Florence's face as she discussed a book. Their hands would brush as they reached for the same volume, causing both to pull back with mumbled apologies and flushed cheeks. The distance between their chairs gradually decreased as weeks passed, until conversations were often conducted in hushed tones despite the empty house. Florence was not naive. She recognized the growing attraction between them, felt it in the quickening of her pulse whenever Xavier entered the room, in the way his smile could warm her from the inside out. But she also understood the vast gulf that separated them, he a wealthy, educated Easterner with unlimited prospects. She a simple farm girl with calloused hands and a hostile father. Xavier, for his part, was fighting a losing battle against his feelings. He had not come to Deeming looking for love, had not expected to find someone who understood him so completely in this remote corner of the territory. Florence's intelligence, her quiet strength, her genuine appreciation for literature and ideas all combined to create an irresistible draw. But he was acutely aware of the complexity of their situation, of the power imbalance between employer and employee, of the damage his attention could do to her reputation. The catalyst came in early October. Florence arrived at the ranch to find Xavier uncharacteristically agitated, pacing the library while the widow dozed on the porch. "What's wrong?" Florence asked, setting down her satchel. Xavier stopped pacing, his expression troubled. "I received a letter from Boston this morning. My mother is ill. The doctors are not optimistic." Florence's heart went out to him. "Oh, Xavier, I'm so sorry." "I need to return east immediately," he continued, running a hand through his hair. "I've already telegraphed for train tickets. I leave tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" Florence echoed, a sudden emptiness opening inside her. "How long will you be gone?" "I don't know," Xavier admitted. "Weeks, perhaps months." He moved closer to her, his voice lowering. "Florence, I need to tell you something before I go." The intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "Yes." "These past months, working with you, talking with you." He hesitated, then continued in a rush. "You've become incredibly important to me, more than a friend, more than an employee. I find myself thinking of you constantly, wondering what you'd think of a passage I'm reading or how you'd approach a problem I'm facing." Florence stood perfectly still, scarcely breathing as he spoke the words that echoed her own feelings. "I know our situations are different," Xavier continued. I know there are obstacles, but I couldn't leave without telling you that I care for you deeply, Florence, and I hope you might feel something similar." The moment stretched between them, fraught with possibility. Florence knew her response could change everything, could open doors to happiness, or ensure they remained firmly closed. "I do," she whispered finally. "I care for you too, Xavier, more than I should, perhaps." Relief and joy transformed his features. He took her hand gently, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "When I return from Boston, we should discuss what that might mean for both of us, if you're willing." Florence nodded, unable to speak past the emotion constricting her throat. The future suddenly seemed both brighter and more uncertain than ever before. Xavier departed the next day, leaving Florence with keys to his home and instructions to continue the cataloging work in his absence. "The house and library are yours to use," he told her. "Consider it your own space until I return." With Widow Jenkins still serving as chaperone, Florence continued her visits to the ranch, though they felt hollow without Xavier's presence. She threw herself into organizing the library, creating the most thorough catalog possible as a surprise for his return. She also took it upon herself to dust the shelves, polish the furniture, and ensure the house remained well maintained. As weeks passed with only brief telegrams from Boston reporting his mother's unchanged condition, Florence found herself missing Xavier with an intensity that surprised her. It wasn't just his conversation or the way he challenged her thinking, it was his quiet strength, his kindness, his ability to see her as she truly was rather than as society dictated she should be. November brought the first real cold snap of the season, and with it, a dramatic change in Florence's circumstances. Her father, returning from town one evening, was grim-faced and agitated. "Pack your things," he ordered without preamble. "Everything you can carry." Florence looked up from the stew she was preparing, alarmed by his tone. "What's happened?" "Banks foreclosing on the farm," Jerome spat, slamming his fist on the table. "Drought's gone on too long and I missed too many payments. We've got 3 days to clear out." The news was devastating but not entirely surprising. Their crops had failed completely this year, and the few remaining cattle had been sold months ago. Florence had known they were struggling, but her father had never shared the true extent of their financial troubles. "Where will we go?" she asked, mind racing. "I've got a cousin in Arizona Territory," Jerome replied. "Wrote to him last month when I saw this coming. He says we can stay with him while I look for work. There's a mine hiring." Florence felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Leaving Deeming meant leaving Xavier's library, leaving the possibility of a future with him, leaving the one place she'd found true happiness. "When do we depart?" "Train leaves Thursday morning," her father said, not meeting her eyes. "I've already sold the tickets." 2 days. She had 2 days to say goodbye to the life she'd built here, to the books she'd come to love, to the hope Xavier had given her. Florence moved through the evening in a daze, mechanically serving dinner and cleaning up afterward while her mind whirled with grief and panic. That night, she made a decision. She would go to Xavier's ranch one last time tomorrow to leave him a letter explaining her sudden departure. She could not simply disappear without a word. The next morning, Florence informed Widow Jenkins of her family's situation. The older woman embraced her with genuine sadness. "Life is cruel sometimes, child," she said, patting Florence's cheek. "But remember, you're stronger than you know, and smarter than most. You'll find your way." "Thank you for everything," Florence replied, fighting back tears. "Would it be possible for me to visit Mr. Harper's ranch one last time today? To leave things in order and write him a note explaining my departure?" The widow nodded understanding. "Of course. I'll arrange for Mr. Thompson's wagon again." But I'm afraid I cannot accompany you. I have a large order from the hotel that cannot wait. Florence hesitated. Going alone would be improper, but this might be her last chance. I'll be brief, she promised. Just long enough to write a letter and make sure everything is secure. The ride to Xavier's ranch was bittersweet. The familiar landscape now tinged with the knowledge that she might never see it again. When she arrived, the empty house seemed to echo with memories. Xavier explaining the origin of a rare volume, their debates by the fireplace, the moment he'd confessed his feelings before departing for Boston. Florence moved through the rooms, trailing her fingers along bookshelves she'd carefully organized, saying silent goodbyes to the volumes she'd come to know intimately. Finally, she sat at Xavier's desk and began to write, pouring her heart onto the page. She explained her father's financial ruin, their imminent departure for Arizona, her devastation at leaving without seeing him again. She thanked him for the gift of his library, for believing in her mind when others dismissed it, for showing her kindness when she needed it most. And finally, with trembling hand, she confessed the full extent of her feelings, not just care or affection, but love that had grown steadily through their months together. I do not know when or if you will read these words, she wrote in conclusion. But I could not leave without telling you that you changed my life, Xavier Harper. You gave me back the world of books my father took from me, but more importantly, you showed me that I deserve that world. Whatever happens now, I will carry that knowledge with me always. Florence sealed the letter and placed it prominently on his desk. She was about to leave when the sound of hoofbeats in the yard made her freeze. Visitors were rare at the isolated ranch, and she suddenly realized how compromising her situation appeared alone in a bachelor's home without a chaperone. Moving to the window, she peered cautiously through the curtain. What she saw made her gasp. Xavier was dismounting from his horse, looking travel-worn but unmistakably himself. Florence's mind raced. She could slip out the back, avoid an encounter that might be awkward or painful given her imminent departure. But something kept her rooted to the spot, perhaps the need for proper closure, or simply the desire to see him one last time. The front door opened, and Xavier stepped inside, removing his hat. He stopped abruptly when he saw her standing in the middle of his library, his expression moving rapidly from surprise to joy to confusion. "Florence," he said, her name a question and greeting combined. "I didn't expect. The widow usually accompanies you." "She had work that couldn't wait," Florence explained quickly. "I came to leave you a letter, actually. I didn't know you were returning today." Xavier moved further into the room, setting his hat on a side table. "My mother's condition improved suddenly. The doctors believe she'll recover fully with time and care. I arranged for a nurse to stay with her and caught the first train west." His eyes softened as they took in her face. "I've missed you." The simple statement unleashed the emotions Florence had been fighting to control. Tears filled her eyes despite her best efforts. "I've missed you too, but Xavier, my father." Xavier closed the distance between them in a few quick strides, concern etching his features. "What is it? What's happened?" "We're leaving," Florence blurted, the words painful to speak aloud. "Tomorrow morning. The bank is foreclosing on our farm. My father has arranged for us to stay with relatives in Arizona while he looks for mining work." Xavier's face paled. "Tomorrow? So soon?" He ran a hand through his hair, his expression increasingly distressed. "No, this cannot happen. There must be a solution." "There isn't," Florence replied sadly. "The farm is lost. My father has already sold most of what we own and purchased train tickets." Xavier began to pace, his mind clearly racing. What if I bought the farm, paid off the bank debt? Your father could continue working the land. The offer was incredibly generous, but Florence shook her head. He would never accept charity, especially not from you. His pride wouldn't allow it. Then what about you? Xavier asked, stopping directly in front of her. Must you go with him? He's my father, Florence said simply, though the question had occurred to her as well. Where else would I go? Xavier took her hands in his touch warm and firm. Stay here in Deeming. With me. Florence stared at him, scarcely believing what she was hearing. What are you suggesting? Marry me, Xavier said, the words rushing out as if he'd been holding them back for too long. I know it's sudden, but the feelings between us are not. These months apart only confirmed what I already knew in October, that I love you, Florence, that I want to build a life with you. Florence's head spun with the suddenness of it all. Xavier, we haven't even. I know, he acknowledged, his thumbs tracing circles on her palms. We've never even kissed. Society would say we're moving too quickly. But I also know that when two minds connect the way ours do, it's rare and precious. I don't want to lose you to circumstance when I've only just found you. His sincerity was undeniable, and Florence felt her heart responding to the truth in his words. Their connection had been immediate and profound from that first day among the books. The months of conversations, of shared ideas and growing affection, had built something stronger than many marriages founded on years of courtship. My father would never consent, she said, though her resolve was weakening. He still sees me as a child, and he distrusts educated men. Then we'll convince him, Xavier replied, his determination evident. Together, let me speak with him, make my case. If he truly wants what's best for you, he'll listen. Florence was torn between hope and despair. Could it really be this simple? Could happiness be within her grasp after all? And if he refuses, Xavier's expression turned serious. You're of legal age, Florence. Ultimately, the choice is yours, not his. I would prefer his blessing, but I will not let his prejudice stand between us if your heart is decided. The boldness of his statement took her breath away. No one had ever suggested that her choices could override her father's authority. The possibility was both terrifying and exhilarating. I need to think, she said finally. This is so much to consider all at once. Xavier nodded, reluctantly releasing her hands. Of course, I shouldn't have overwhelmed you. He gestured to the letter on his desk. Is this what you came to leave me? Florence felt her cheeks warm. Yes, it explains everything about the farm, about leaving, and other things. May I read it now? He asked softly. After a moment's hesitation, Florence nodded. She watched as Xavier opened the envelope and began to read, his expression growing increasingly tender with each paragraph. When he reached the end, he looked up at her with eyes shining with emotion. You love me, he said, the statement filled with wonder. Yes, Florence whispered, unable to deny what she'd committed to paper. I do. Xavier crossed to her in 2 strides and gently cradled her face in his hands. Then let me court you properly, Florence Sullivan. Let me speak to your father. Let me prove to him and to you that my intentions are honorable and my love is true. Florence's heart soared at his words. For the first time, she allowed herself to truly believe that happiness might be possible. Yes, she agreed, her voice stronger now. Yes, speak to him. Tonight, before it's too late. Xavier's smile was radiant. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a gentle, questioning kiss. Florence responded hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence as warmth spread through her entire being. It was brief but perfect, a promise of things to come. When they separated, Xavier kept hold of her hand. We should go now before the hour grows any later. Will your father be at home? Yes, Florence replied, still slightly dazed from the kiss. He's packing what little remains of our belongings. They rode together to the Sullivan farm, Xavier on his stallion and Florence in the borrowed wagon. The journey passed in nervous anticipation, both lost in thoughts of what awaited them. Jerome Sullivan was in the barn when they arrived, sorting through tools to determine what to take and what to leave behind. His expression darkened when he saw Xavier dismounting beside his daughter. "Mr. Sullivan," Xavier greeted him formally, extending his hand. "I'm Xavier Harper. I believe we met briefly at church some months ago." Jerome ignored the offered hand. "I know who you are, the Easterner who's been taking up my daughter's time with your fancy books." His eyes narrowed suspiciously. "What brings you here?" Xavier lowered his hand but stood tall, unintimidated by the older man's hostility. "I've come to speak with you about Florence's future, sir, and to make you a proposition." Jerome snorted derisively. "Unless you're buying this worthless farm for twice what it's worth, I've got no interest in your propositions." "Actually," Xavier replied calmly, "I am interested in purchasing your land, but that's a separate matter. I'm here primarily because I wish to marry your daughter." The bluntness of the statement left Jerome momentarily speechless. He looked from Xavier to Florence, who stood nervously nearby. "Is this some kind of joke?" "No, Pa," Florence said, stepping forward. "Xavier and I have grown close these past months. He cares for me and I for him." Jerome's face flushed with anger. "So this is why you've been so eager to work at his place, not for the money at all, but to catch yourself a wealthy husband." "That's not fair," Florence protested. "It wasn't like that." Xavier intervened smoothly. "Mr. Sullivan, I understand your concern. From your perspective, this must seem sudden. But I assure you, my intentions toward Florence are honorable. I admire her intelligence, her work ethic, her character. I believe we could build a good life together." "And what do you know about her?" Jerome demanded. "Do you know she can't cook worth a damn? That she daydreams when she should be working? That she'd rather read some fool book than do what needs doing? I know that she's kind, even to those who don't deserve it," Xavier replied evenly. "I know that she has one of the sharpest minds I've ever encountered, man or woman. I know that she works herself to exhaustion between your farm and the widow's laundry, yet still finds time to help neighbors in need." Florence stared at Xavier, moved by his defense. No one had ever stood up for her this way before. Jerome seemed momentarily taken aback by Xavier's response, but quickly rallied. "She's not for your kind. You'll grow tired of her once the novelty wears off, and then where will she be? Abandoned in a strange place with no family." "I'm not that kind of man," Xavier said firmly. "When I make a commitment, I honor it. Ask anyone in town about my business dealings if you doubt my word." Jerome turned to Florence, his expression hardening. "And you'd leave your own father for this man you barely know." The question hit Florence like a physical blow. Despite his flaws, despite his cruelty about her books, Jerome Sullivan was still her father, the only family she had left. "I don't want to leave you, Pa," she said softly, "but I need to make my own life. I'm not a child anymore." "If I may," Xavier interjected carefully, "I have another proposal that might address everyone's concerns." He looked between father and daughter. "As I mentioned, I'm interested in purchasing your land, Mr. Sullivan. Not out of charity, but because it adjoins property I already own and would be valuable for expanding my ranch operations." Jerome eyed him suspiciously. "Go on." "I would pay a fair price enough to clear your debts with the bank and leave you with a reasonable sum. Additionally, I would offer you employment managing the property. You know this land better than anyone. It would be foolish of me not to utilize that expertise." The offer hung in the air between them. Jerome's eyes narrowed as he considered it. "And if I refuse? If I forbid this marriage and take Florence to Arizona anyway?" Xavier's expression remained calm, but his voice carried an undercurrent of steel. "Then you would be denying your daughter happiness out of pride and prejudice, not out of love. And eventually, she would have to choose between honoring your wishes and following her heart." Florence held her breath as her father processed Xavier's words. She could see the conflicting emotions on his face: anger, suspicion, but also a flicker of something that might have been shame. Finally, Jerome turned to Florence. "Is this truly what you want, girl? Not just the fancy house and the books, but him? You've thought this through?" "I have, Pa," Florence replied steadily, meeting his gaze. "I love him, and I believe he loves me. We could be happy together." Jerome was silent for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, the fight seemed to go out of him. He suddenly looked older, tired. "Your mother always said you were too smart for your own good," he said gruffly. "Said you'd fly away from us someday. Guess she was right after all." Hope flared in Florence's chest. "Does that mean?" "Means I won't stand in your way," Jerome conceded reluctantly. "Don't much like it, but I won't stop you." He turned to Xavier with a hard stare. "As for your offer on the farm, we'll discuss terms tomorrow. I won't be beholden to my daughter's husband. If I take the job, it'll be because I earned it." "I wouldn't have it any other way, sir," Xavier replied, extending his hand again. This time, after a brief hesitation, Jerome shook it. The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Xavier purchased the Sullivan farm for a generous sum, allowing Jerome to pay off his debts and still have money remaining. True to his word, Xavier hired him as farm manager, with a small cabin on the property as part of his compensation. Meanwhile, Florence and Xavier's engagement became the talk of Deeming. Some gossips questioned the speed of the arrangement or the differences in their backgrounds, but most townspeople were supportive. Having witnessed the positive changes Xavier had brought to the community through his investments and Florence's growth from shy farm girl to confident young woman. Widow Jenkins took particular delight in helping Florence prepare for her new role, offering practical advice on running a household and gifting her a beautiful quilt for her marriage bed. "I always knew you were destined for more than laundry work," she confided with a wink. "That mind of yours needs proper feeding." The wedding took place in early December, a simple ceremony in Deeming's small church followed by a reception at Xavier's ranch, now their ranch. Florence wore a dress of ivory satin ordered from Santa Fe, with lace at the collar and cuffs. Xavier couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked down the aisle on her father's arm, his expression one of reverent joy. Jerome Sullivan, uncomfortable in his Sunday best, but making an effort for his daughter's sake, gave her away with gruff dignity. Though still not entirely reconciled to the match, he had softened somewhat in recent weeks as he observed the genuine affection between Florence and Xavier, and as his own circumstances improved under the new arrangement. As husband and wife, Florence and Xavier quickly established a rhythm to their shared life. Mornings were spent on ranch business, Xavier working with the hands, Florence managing the household and correspondence. Afternoons often found them in the library, sometimes working separately, sometimes reading aloud to each other from favorite volumes. Evenings were for conversation, music. Xavier had surprised Florence with a piano as a wedding gift, and increasingly, the intimate discovery of each other as lovers. Their first Christmas as a married couple brought another surprise. Xavier had been mysteriously absent for several hours each day in the weeks leading up to the holiday, claiming ranch business that required his personal attention. On Christmas Eve, after dinner, he blindfolded Florence and led her carefully through the house and out onto the porch. "What are you doing?" she laughed, reaching for the blindfold. "Patience," Xavier chided gently, stopping her hands. "Just a few more steps." He guided her down the porch steps and across the yard, then positioned her carefully. Ready when she nodded, he removed the blindfold. Florence blinked in the fading twilight, then gasped at the sight before her. A small building stood where there had been only empty space before, its windows glowing with warm light. "What is this?" she whispered, turning to Xavier in confusion. "Your Christmas gift," he replied, taking her hand. "Come see." He led her to the door and opened it with a flourish. Inside, Florence found a perfect miniature library, smaller than the one in their home but exquisitely appointed, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, comfortable reading chairs, a small writing desk, and a pot-bellied stove for warmth. "I don't understand," Florence said, moving into the space with wonder. "We already have a library." "We do," Xavier agreed, following her inside. "But that's our library. This one is yours alone, a sanctuary, if you will." He gestured to the shelves, which Florence now noticed held familiar volumes. "These are replacements for every book your father burned, as near as I could determine from your descriptions, plus a few new ones I thought you might enjoy." Florence turned in a slow circle, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the gift. Not just the books or the building, but the understanding behind it, Xavier's recognition of what the loss had meant to her, his desire to heal that wound. "There's one more thing," Xavier said softly, drawing her attention to a small pedestal near the window. On it sat a handsome leather-bound book with no title on the spine. "Open it." With trembling fingers, Florence lifted the cover. Inside, in Xavier's distinctive handwriting, was an inscription. "For Florence, who taught me that the most valuable library is not the one with the most books, but the one that contains the most wisdom, courage, and love. These are the qualities you bring to every page of our life together." "All my heart, Xavier." Below the inscription, the pages were blank, a journal, waiting to be filled. "I thought," Xavier said hesitantly, "that perhaps you might want to write your own story someday. Your thoughts, your experiences, maybe even a novel if you're inclined." Florence couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. Instead, she threw her arms around her husband, burying her face in his shoulder as tears of gratitude and joy spilled freely. "Thank you," she whispered when she could finally find her voice. "Not just for this, but for everything. For seeing me when I was invisible, for valuing what others dismissed." She pulled back to meet his eyes. "For loving me as I am." Xavier cradled her face in his hands. "Loving you is the easiest thing I've ever done, Florence Harper, and the most rewarding." He kissed her gently, then more deeply as she responded with equal fervor. Later that night, as they lay in each other's arms in the master bedroom of their home, Florence realized how completely her life had transformed in less than a year. From the devastation of watching her books burn to the joy of having not just one library but two. From the constraints of her father's narrow views to the freedom of partnership with a man who celebrated her mind. From isolation to belonging. "What are you thinking about?" Xavier asked, noting her contemplative expression. "How strange life's path can be," Florence replied, tracing patterns on his chest with her fingertip. "If my father hadn't burned my books that day, we might never have met, or at least not in the same way." Xavier caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "Perhaps some good can come even from acts of cruelty when they lead us where we're meant to be." "Perhaps," Florence agreed, snuggling closer to his warmth. "Though I prefer to think it was your kindness, not his cruelty, that brought us together." "Either way," Xavier murmured, his voice growing drowsy, "I'm grateful for whatever forces conspired to bring you into my library that day." "As am I," Florence whispered, closing her eyes contentedly. "As am I." Spring came early to southern New Mexico the following year, bringing unexpected rain that transformed the parched landscape into a carpet of wildflowers. The Sullivan farm, now incorporated into Harper Ranch, produced its first successful crop in 3 years, vindicating Xavier's faith in the land and Jerome's knowledge of how to work it. The older man remained gruff and somewhat reserved, but his attitude toward his son-in-law had softened considerably as he witnessed Xavier's genuine commitment to both the ranch and to Florence's happiness. Though he rarely visited their home, preferring the solitude of his cabin, Jerome did occasionally join them for Sunday dinner, even sitting through Florence's after-meal reading sessions without complaint. More significant was his gradual acknowledgement of his daughter's intelligence. When a dispute arose with a neighboring rancher over water rights, Jerome surprised everyone by suggesting they ask Florence what she thinks. Her solution, drawing on knowledge gleaned from legal texts in Xavier's library, satisfied both parties and averted a potentially costly court battle. "You always were too smart for your own good," Jerome had grumbled afterward, but there was a note of pride beneath the complaint that warmed Florence's heart. As for Florence and Xavier, their partnership deepened with each passing month. Xavier's business ventures in Deeming, now including a small hotel and part ownership in the mercantile, flourished under their joint management. Florence's organizational skills and quick mind complemented Xavier's vision and capital, creating enterprises that benefited not just their family but the entire community. Florence's personal library became her special retreat, a place to read, write, and reflect. The journal Xavier had given her for Christmas was now half filled with her observations, stories, and dreams. Some entries were private reflections, others were the beginnings of what might someday become proper stories or essays. Xavier never pried, respecting the space as truly hers, but he delighted in the excerpts she occasionally shared with him. On their first wedding anniversary, Xavier surprised Florence with another addition to her sanctuary, a small printing press and associated equipment. "What on earth am I to do with this?" she asked, laughing as she examined the complicated machinery. "Whatever you wish," Xavier replied. "Publish a small local newspaper, perhaps, or print your own stories when you're ready to share them more widely. I thought it might be useful for the school as well." The school was their newest joint project, a small but proper educational institution for Deeming's children, housed in a building Xavier had purchased and renovated. Florence served as its primary teacher 3 days a week, finding unexpected joy in sharing her love of learning with eager young minds. Several of her older female students had become regular visitors to her library, borrowing books under her guidance and developing their own passion for reading. "You've created a generation of book-loving girls," Xavier observed one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "Your father would be horrified." Florence smiled at the gentle teasing. "He's coming around. I saw him showing young Thomas Miller how to use the dictionary last week when they thought no one was looking." Xavier laughed, taking her hand in his. "Miracles never cease." His expression grew more serious as he studied her face. "Are you happy, Florence, truly?" She considered the question, though the answer was obvious to her. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she replied honestly. "I have books, meaningful work, the respect of the community." She squeezed his hand. "And a husband who loves both my heart and my mind. What more could any woman want?" Xavier's smile turned slightly mysterious. "Perhaps one thing more in time." Before Florence could question his meaning, he changed the subject, asking about her plans for the school's upcoming spring exhibition. But his cryptic comment lingered in her thoughts. She understood its significance 2 months later, when morning sickness confirmed what her missed monthly courses had suggested. Florence was with their child due to arrive in late autumn. Xavier's joy at the news was boundless. He immediately began making plans for a nursery, ordering books on infant care and childhood education, and hovering over Florence with such constant concern for her well-being that she finally had to banish him to his office for a few hours each day, for the sake of my sanity. "The baby won't be here for 7 more months," she reminded him, laughing at his enthusiasm. "There's plenty of time to prepare." But Xavier was undeterred. "Our child will have every advantage," he declared. "The best of both worlds, books and open spaces, ideas and practical knowledge." He placed a gentle hand on Florence's still flat stomach. "He or she will never know the limitations your father tried to place on you." Florence covered his hand with her own, moved by his determination. "No, our child will be free to explore, to question, to learn. Boy or girl, they'll know the value of both work and knowledge." As Florence's pregnancy progressed, she continued teaching at the school and managing their business affairs, though she gradually reduced her hours as her energy waned. Xavier took up the slack without complaint, while also ensuring she had ample time for rest and for the writing that had become increasingly important to her. In her 7th month, Florence completed her first full-length story, a fictionalized account of a young woman's journey from intellectual oppression to freedom through the power of books and the support of a kind mentor. She shared it with Xavier one evening in her library, reading the entire manuscript aloud while he listened attentively. "It's wonderful," he said when she'd finished, his eyes shining with pride. "You must publish it." Florence blushed at the praise. "It needs work still. And it's rather personal, don't you think? Anyone who knows us would recognize the inspiration." "All the best stories draw from life," Xavier argued, "and this one could help other young women who feel trapped as you once did." He leaned forward earnestly. "Use the printing press. Make a dozen copies to start. Share them with the older girls at the school, with Widow Jenkins, with the ladies from church." His faith in her work gave Florence courage. Over the following weeks, with Xavier's help operating the more cumbersome aspects of the press, she printed and bound 10 copies of her story, titling it simply "Reading Freedom." The response from her small circle of readers was overwhelmingly positive. Widow Jenkins declared it the finest story I've read in years, while Florence's oldest student, 17-year-old Rebecca Torres, confided that it had given her the courage to ask her parents about attending the Teachers' College in Santa Fe. Most surprising was her father's reaction. Florence had not intended to give him a copy, certain he would dismiss or even resent the thinly veiled portrayal of their conflict. But Jerome, hearing about the story from town gossip, appeared at their door one evening asking gruffly if he might have a look at this book everyone's talking about. 2 days later, he returned it without comment. Florence assumed he had either not read it or had disliked it too much to say so. But as weeks passed, she began hearing from townspeople that Jerome Sullivan was recommending his daughter's story to anyone who would listen, even carrying a copy in his wagon to show to farmers from outlying areas. "He's proud of you," Xavier told her as they prepared for bed one night in late October, Florence's belly now so swollen she needed help with the simplest tasks. "In his own way, he's trying to make amends." "I never thought I'd see the day," Florence admitted, wincing as the baby delivered a particularly energetic kick. "After all those years of dismissing my reading as foolishness." Xavier placed his hand on her stomach, grinning as he felt the movement within. "People can change when shown a different path. Your father is learning that, just as you're teaching the entire town to value education for all their children, not just the boys." Florence covered his hand with her own. "We're teaching them, together." Their son, Thomas Benjamin Harper, arrived on a crisp November morning after a long but uncomplicated labor. He had Xavier's dark hair and Florence's thoughtful expression, and from his earliest days, he seemed equally captivated by the sound of his father's deep voice and his mother's gentle storytelling. The first time Jerome held his grandson, his weathered face softened in a way Florence had not seen since before her mother's death. "He has the Sullivan chin," the older man declared with satisfaction, "and the look of your mother about the eyes." Florence, watching from her bed, felt a circle closing past connecting to future through this tiny new life. "Would you like to read to him sometime, Pa?" she asked impulsively. "When he's a bit older." Jerome looked startled, then contemplative. "Suppose I could," he said finally. "Your mother used to read to you. Seems only fitting." As Thomas grew from infant to toddler, the Harper household expanded again with the arrival of twin girls, Elizabeth and Catherine, born 18 months after their brother. The children thrived in an environment rich with both intellectual stimulation and practical experiences, dividing their time between books and outdoor adventures. Xavier proved to be a devoted father, reading to the children every evening before bed and teaching Thomas to ride almost as soon as the boy could walk. Florence combined motherhood with her teaching and writing, publishing a series of educational stories for children that gained popularity throughout the territory. 5 years after burning his daughter's books in a fit of ignorant rage, Jerome Sullivan could be found sitting on the porch of his cabin with his grandchildren clustered around him, reading aloud from a volume of American folk tales. His voice, once harsh with disappointment and bitterness, had softened into the gentle cadence of a natural storyteller. "Again, Grandpa," 3-year-old Elizabeth would demand when he finished a tale, her small face alight with the same love of stories that had once shone in her mother's. And Jerome, catching Florence's eye over the children's heads, would nod once in acknowledgement of the journey they had both taken, he from book burner to reader of tales, she from oppressed daughter to accomplished woman. On warm summer evenings, the entire Harper family often gathered in Florence's library, each absorbed in their own chosen volume yet connected by their shared love of words. Xavier might be reviewing business ledgers while Florence drafted her next story. Thomas, at 7 already a fluent reader, would be deep in an adventure tale, while the twins looked at picture books, making up their own stories to match the illustrations. Sometimes, watching her family surrounded by books in the sanctuary Xavier had built for her, Florence would remember that terrible day when her father had burned her treasured volumes. The memory no longer brought pain, only gratitude for how far they had all come and for the unexpected path that had led her to a life beyond her wildest dreams. "What are you thinking?" Xavier would ask, catching her contemplative expression, and Florence would smile, her heart full. That sometimes, from the ashes of old dreams, new and better ones can grow if someone cares enough to nurture them. Xavier would return her smile, understanding as he always did. "And sometimes," he would add softly, "a simple act of kindness like building a library for a book-loving girl can change the course of many lives." Together, they had created not just a physical library of books, but a legacy of learning, a family founded on mutual respect and shared passions, and a community forever changed by their belief that knowledge belonged to everyone regardless of gender, background, or circumstance. It was a story worth telling, a story worth living, a story that had grown like the most treasured books from the fertile soil of imagination nourished by love.